If you're lying in bed, eyes heavy, wondering what could possibly lull you to sleep faster than counting sheep in chainmail, let me introduce you to a man whose final days were so bloated, so bizarre, and so historically pungent, they make even the dullest history lecture feel like a roller coaster. This is the story of King Henry VIII. Once a dashing monarch with a jawline sharp enough to slice rebellion, now reduced to a wheezing mound of royal regret, surrounded by terrified physicians, haunted by ex-wives, some headless, and plagued by a leg ulcer that smelled like betrayal. There will be no dragons, no daring escapes, no romantic triumphs, just a slow, tragic, occasionally flatulent descent into royal oblivion. So fluff your pillow, silence your phone, and prepare to drift off to the soothing sounds of Tudor misery. And hey, before you snore your way into the 16th century, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments from which candlelit corner of the world you're watching. Whether you're tuning in from a 4-poster bed in Yorkshire or a beanbag in Lahore, your sleepy support keeps this royal wheeze alive, because nothing says sweet dreams like a monarch who ate too much swan and died surrounded by cushions. Once upon a time, specifically in the winter of 1547, King Henry VIII sat upon his throne, which was less a seat of power and more a glorified cushioned fortress. The throne had been reinforced with extra padding, not for comfort, but because the king had grown so magnificently rotund that lesser chairs simply gave up. Henry, once the golden boy of Christendom, now resembled a roast ham in velvet. His days of jousting, dancing, and seducing noblewomen had long passed. Now, he mostly seduced pies. The king's appetite was legendary. He consumed mutton with the enthusiasm of a man who believed vegetables were a French conspiracy. His meals were less courses and more sieges. Breakfast involved 6 eggs, a loaf of bread, and something called beef pudding, which historians still debate. Lunch was a parade of meats, and dinner was a reenactment of the Battle of Agincourt, but with gravy. His cooks, terrified of royal wrath, prepared dishes so rich they could bankrupt a monastery. One unfortunate chef once served a salad. He was never seen again. But it wasn't just the food. Oh no, it was the aftermath. The king's digestion had become a matter of national concern. Courtiers developed a system of coded coughs to warn each other of incoming royal flatulence. 1 cough meant brace yourself. 2 coughs meant run. 3 coughs meant abandon palace. Henry's physicians, a collection of men who looked like they'd lost bets with God, tried everything. They prescribed herbs, poultices, and once, a potion made from boiled owl. Nothing worked. The king's belly rumbled like distant thunder, and his leg ulcer, affectionately nicknamed Sir Festeringham, had begun to smell like betrayal. Still, Henry remained defiant. "I am the King of England," he bellowed, while chewing on a turkey leg the size of a toddler. "I shall eat what I please." And eat he did, until one day, after a particularly ambitious banquet involving swan, eel pie, and something called jellied boar, the king felt off. He clutched his stomach. He groaned. He demanded a lute solo to distract him from the pain. The lute player, panicked, played Greensleeves backwards. It did not help. Henry was wheeled to his chambers, where he lay among 17 pillows, 3 terrified physicians, and 1 confused jester. The jester tried a fart joke. Henry did not laugh. The jester was reassigned to the royal stables, and so the king began his slow, wheezy descent, not with a bang, but with indigestion. By the time Henry VIII's leg ulcer had its own nickname, its own entourage, and its own scent, it was clear to everyone in the palace that the king's lower limb had become a national emergency. The ulcer, affectionately dubbed Sir Festeringham by the more sarcastic courtiers, had started as a minor sore, perhaps from a poorly timed joust or an ill-fitting boot. But over the years, it had blossomed into something far more dramatic. It oozed, it wept, it occasionally hissed. One courtier swore it whispered Latin curses at night. Physicians gathered around it like monks around a relic. They poked it, prodded it, and applied concoctions that smelled like despair. One tried honey, another tried wine, a third tried prayer. None succeeded. Henry, meanwhile, was not amused. "It is but a scratch," he declared, as servants wheeled him around the palace like a royal wheel of cheese. A king does not succumb to scratches. But the leg disagreed. It throbbed. It puffed. It turned shades of purple that hadn't been invented yet. The smell was so potent that the royal falcon refused to perch near him. Even the royal dogs, creatures known for their loyalty and questionable taste, began sleeping in the hallway. The king's mood soured. He barked at servants. He threw goblets. He demanded that the ulcer be knighted, then unknighted, then exiled. The ulcer remained unmoved. One physician, desperate to impress, suggested a poultice made from moss, goat's milk, and powdered unicorn horn. Henry approved. The poultice was applied. The ulcer laughed. Meanwhile, the court tried to pretend everything was fine. Banquets were held. Music was played. But the shadow of Sir Festeringham loomed large. At one feast, a lute player fainted mid-song from the fumes. At another, a roast pig was mistaken for the king's leg and nearly served. Henry's sleep became erratic. He tossed. He turned. He demanded bedtime stories about his own greatness. One night, he asked for a tale about the time he danced so well. France declared war out of jealousy. The storyteller improvised. Henry snored, but the ulcer never slept. It pulsed in the moonlight, a reminder that even kings are not immune to the slow, humiliating march of biology. And as Henry lay among his pillows, surrounded by worried physicians and increasingly sarcastic servants, he began to suspect that perhaps, just perhaps, the leg was winning. As King Henry VIII lay among his 17 pillows, his leg ulcer humming like a cursed kettle, he began to experience what the court physicians politely called phantasmic episodes, and what the jester called wife hauntings. It started with a chill in the air, not the usual draft from the palace, S400 uninsulated windows, but a spectral breeze that smelled faintly of lavender and disappointment. Henry stirred. "Who goes there?" he wheezed, clutching a turkey leg like a scepter. From the shadows emerged a vision in silk. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, regal and stern. "I told you divorcing me would be bad for your health," she said, arms crossed, ghostly eyebrow raised. Henry blinked. "You're not real," he muttered. "You're just indigestion." "Indigestion doesn't speak Spanish," she replied. Moments later, Anne Boleyn floated in, head tucked under her arm like a handbag. "Still blaming me for everything?" she asked. I was witty, charming, and only mildly treasonous. Henry groaned. "You flirted with my lute player." Anne shrugged. "He had nice hands." Then came Jane Seymour, glowing softly like a Tudor nightlight. "I died giving you a son," she whispered, "and you named him Edward." "Edward," Henry sniffled. "It was a good name. It was a boring name," she replied, vanishing into the curtains. Anne of Cleves appeared next, holding a portrait. "Remember this?" she said. "You married me based on this painting, then called me a horse." Henry winced. "The artist lied." "You lied more," she said, tossing the portrait onto his lap. "Catherine Howard danced in, youthful and giggly." "I was 17, she chirped. "You were not." Henry tried to sit up. "You betrayed me." "You smelled like soup," she replied, twirling away. Finally, Catherine Parr, the survivor, entered with a book. "I wrote theology," she said. "You ignored it." Henry sighed. "I was busy. Busy marrying 6 women and inventing gout?" she asked. The ghosts gathered around his bed, a spectral sorority of royal regret. They whispered, they giggled, they judged. Henry tried to command them to leave, but his voice cracked like old parchment. "I am your king," he wheezed. Anne Boleyn leaned in. "You were our husband, and frankly, not a great one." The room grew quiet. The ghosts faded. The ulcer gurgled. Henry lay back, exhausted, haunted not just by spirits, but by the realization that history was not on his side. He closed his eyes, muttering, "At least I didn't marry 7. From the corner, the jester whispered, "Yet, if you ever wondered what medieval medicine looked like, imagine a group of men in robes, arguing over whether boiled badger or fermented turnip juice would cure a leg that smelled like betrayal." King Henry VIII's court physicians were a collection of well-meaning lunatics, each armed with a theory, a tincture, and a beard that could store herbs. Their medical training consisted of Latin phrases, vague astrology, and a firm belief that most problems could be solved by bleeding someone until they fainted. Henry's leg ulcer, Sir Festeringham, as it was now known in palace gossip, had become their greatest challenge. They gathered around it daily, like monks around a sacred relic, whispering ideas that ranged from apply goose fat to summon a barber. One physician, Dr. Wimpleton, suggested leeches. "They balance the humors," he declared, while holding a jar of squirming optimism. Henry, groggy and gassy, waved him away. "I am not a pond," he muttered. Another, Dr. Thistlewhack, proposed a poultice made of moss, garlic, and powdered antler. "It worked on a sheep once," he claimed. The sheep, it turned out, had died. Dr. Poxworthy, the youngest and most enthusiastic, believed in sweating out the evil. He wrapped the king in blankets, lit a fire, and waited. Henry sweated. The ulcer gurgled. The blankets caught fire. The experiment was discontinued. Meanwhile, the jester, now reassigned as assistant apothecary due to budget cuts, offered his own remedy, laughter. "It's the best medicine," he chirped, juggling oranges near the ulcer. One orange exploded. The ulcer hissed. The jester was reassigned again, this time to the royal laundry. Henry, increasingly irritable, began issuing medical decrees. "No more potions that smell like soup," he bellowed. "No more ointments that attract cats." He banned mustard plasters, eel compresses, and anything involving goat saliva. The physicians, desperate, turned to astrology. "Mars is in retrograde," said Dr. Wimpleton. "That explains the swelling." "Mars is always in retrograde," muttered a servant. One night, they tried chanting. Another night, they tried silence. On Tuesday, They tried wrapping the leg in pages from the Book of Common Prayer. The ulcer remained unimpressed, and so the king lay in bed, surrounded by men who smelled of vinegar and failure, wondering if perhaps death was preferable to another round of medicinal goose vapor. The ulcer pulsed. The physician scribbled. The jester ironed socks. By the 5th week of Henry VIII's final wheezathon, the royal carpenters had stopped pretending his throne was a chair. It was now officially classified as a structural hazard with upholstery. The king, once a proud specimen of Renaissance masculinity, now required a throne reinforced with oak beams, goose feathers, and the prayers of 3 bishops. It creaked ominously whenever he shifted, which was often because his leg ulcer, Sir Festeringham, had developed a vendetta against sitting still. To ease the royal discomfort, the palace staff began adding cushions. 1, then 2, then 17. Eventually, Henry sat atop a wobbling tower of velvet pillows, looking less like a monarch and more like a confused souffle. "Bring more cushions," he bellowed one morning, as his throne emitted a sound not unlike a dying accordion. "My royal posterior demands softness." The servants complied. They brought cushions embroidered with lions, unicorns, and one unfortunate pillow that featured Anne Boleyn's face. That one was quietly removed. But the more cushions they added, the more unstable the throne became. One afternoon, during a particularly dramatic reading of the royal will, Henry leaned forward to sneeze and vanished into the pile. It took 3 guards and a lute player to extract him. The throne was now a metaphor, a padded monument to excess, regret, and questionable lumbar support. Courtiers whispered that it was cursed. The jester claimed it was sentient. The royal falcon refused to perch near it. Henry, however, remained loyal. "It cradles me like destiny," he declared, while sinking slowly into the cushioned abyss. "It understands my pain." The physicians, ever concerned, suggested a firmer seat. Henry threw a goblet at them. "I am not a peasant," he roared. "I shall not sit on wood like some common turnip." And so the throne remained, a wobbly, overstuffed symbol of a king who had once ruled with fire and fury, and now ruled with fluff and farts. At night, the throne groaned under the weight of royal consequence. Henry snored, the ulcer pulsed, and the cushions dreamed of simpler times. If Henry VIII's leg ulcer was the court's greatest horror, his gout was its loudest. It began, as all royal ailments did, with a dramatic sigh. "My foot," Henry declared one morning, "has betrayed me." He pointed at it as if it were a French ambassador. "It throbs with the fury of 1,000 rebellions." The foot, swollen and red, peeked out from beneath a mound of furs like a guilty ham. It had once danced at court, stomped in tournaments, and kicked at least one lute player. Now it simply sat there, pulsing with royal rage. The physicians, already traumatized by Sir Festeringham, approached the gout with caution. "It's the king's humors," said Dr. Wimpleton. "They're unbalanced. They're staging a coup," muttered the jester, who had been reassigned again, this time as the royal footstool. Henry's gout dictated the rhythm of the palace. If the king's foot was angry, no one danced. If it was calm, there was music. If it was throbbing, all meetings were canceled, and the kitchens were ordered to prepare comfort meats. The foot had moods. It had opinions. It had its own cushion, its own servant, and, briefly, its own title. Lord Throbwell of Ankle upon Sore. Henry insisted it be addressed formally. "Bow to the foot," he once commanded. "It suffers for England." The court complied. They bowed. They curtsied. One unfortunate ambassador from Venice kissed it. He was never invited back. To ease the pain, the physicians tried everything. Cold compresses, warm compresses, compresses made of swan feathers and regret. Nothing worked. The foot remained swollen, angry, and deeply theatrical. Henry began speaking to it. "We are not amused," he told it one evening. "We demand peace." The foot responded by twitching violently. The jester fainted. Eventually, the king took to wheeling himself around the palace in a velvet-lined cart, foot elevated like a relic. He barked orders from his mobile throne, demanding more cushions, fewer stairs, and a ban on tight shoes. The gout, like the ulcer, had become a character in the royal drama, a throbbing crimson reminder that even kings are not immune to the consequences of too much mutton and not enough moderation. And so, the palace tiptoed, the foot pulsed, the ulcer gurgled, and Henry, surrounded by pillows, poultices, and people pretending not to gag, ruled on, one swollen toe at a time, in the twilight of Henry VIII's reign, as his leg ulcer plotted rebellion and his gout demanded diplomatic immunity. Another crisis emerged, one of fashion, pride, and deeply questionable tailoring. The royal codpiece, once a proud symbol of Tudor masculinity, Henry's codpiece had grown in size, complexity, and mystery. It was no longer just a garment. It was a statement, a fortress, a padded proclamation that the king was still virile, even if he hadn't danced in a decade and required 3 men to lift his leg. The codpiece was embroidered, bejeweled, and, according to one terrified tailor, lightly armored. It jutted from his robes like a velvet battering ram, demanding attention and raising eyebrows across Europe. Foreign ambassadors whispered about it. Courtiers avoided eye contact. The royal falcon once tried to perch on it, but as Henry's health declined, so did his ability to wear it with dignity. The codpiece, once majestic, now sagged slightly to the left. It squeaked when he walked. It required its own valet. One morning, the jester, now reassigned as codpiece consultant, noticed something alarming. "Your Majesty," he whispered, "the codpiece appears sentient." Henry blinked. "It has always been sentient," he replied. "It is the seat of my power." Rumor spread. Was the codpiece hiding something? Was it stuffed with royal secrets? One courtier claimed it contained the original draft of the Act of Supremacy. Another swore it was filled with goose feathers and denial. The tailors, sworn to secrecy, refused to comment. One was caught trying to measure it and was promptly reassigned to the royal moat. Another tried to replace it with a more modest version and was chased out of the palace by Henry S. Gouty Foot. Eventually, the codpiece became a political symbol. Supporters of the king praised its boldness. Critics called it the Velvet Lie. A pamphlet circulated titled "The Codpiece and the Crown," a study in overcompensation. Henry ordered it burned. Twice. At night, the codpiece sat on its own cushion, guarded by 2 servants and a small dog named Reginald. It gleamed in the candlelight, a relic of a time when kings could be both terrifying and absurd. And as Henry wheezed in his bed, surrounded by pillows, ulcers, and increasingly sarcastic ghosts, he whispered to his codpiece, "You and I, we were glorious." The codpiece said nothing, but it shimmered, ever so slightly, in agreement. By the 8th week of Henry VIII's slow descent into royal mushiness, the palace had developed a new protocol, the wind alert system. It wasn't for weather, it was for Henry. The king's digestive system, once a proud engine fueled by roast swan and mutton pies, had become a volatile force of nature. His flatulence was no longer a private matter. It was a public hazard. Courtiers tiptoed through the halls like nervous mice, ears perked for the dreaded sound. The royal trumpet, it began one morning in the Great Hall, during a reading of the royal will. Henry shifted in his cushioned fortress, and a sound emerged, long, mournful, and vaguely musical. The lute player paused. The falcon squawked. A tapestry fell off the wall. Thus was born Sir Flatulence, the unofficial seventh wife, the ghostly presence that haunted every chamber Henry entered. The jester, now reassigned as Minister of Air Quality, began issuing coded warnings. One bell meant, brace yourself. 2 bells meant, open windows. 3 bells meant, evacuate. The Chamber of Whiffs, formerly the Privy Council room, was retrofitted with scented candles, herbal sachets, and a priest who specialized in exorcisms. It's not a demon, the priest muttered one day, fanning himself with a scroll. It's just lunch. Henry, of course, was oblivious. My body is a temple, he declared, while consuming a bowl of goose stew and a side of regret. It sings with royal vigor. The body sang. The temple trembled. Physicians blamed the humors. Servants blamed the pies. One brave soul blamed the codpiece, claiming it trapped the vapors. He was reassigned to the moat. At night, the palace echoed with mysterious sounds. Was it the wind? Was it the king? Was it the ghost of Anne Boleyn sighing in disapproval? No one knew, but everyone wore lavender under their robes, just in case. Henry's bedchamber was fitted with a ventilation system involving bellows, fans, and one very tired monk. The monk wrote a poem titled Ode to the Royal Breeze. It was banned immediately, and so the king ruled on, wheezing, groaning, and occasionally clearing rooms with nothing but a shift in posture. Sir Flatulence became legend. The Chamber of Whiffs became a cautionary tale, and the palace, ever loyal, learned to breathe shallowly and walk briskly. Because in the final days of Henry VIII, history wasn't written with ink. It was written in whiffs. The final banquet of King Henry VIII was not the feast of legends. There were no roasted peacocks, no fountains of wine, and certainly no lute solos. Not after the last lute player fainted from ulcer fumes. Instead, it was a quiet affair, a sleepy, breathy, deeply beige banquet. The kitchens, once a roaring furnace of culinary ambition, had grown cautious. The king's digestive system had become a battlefield, and every dish was a potential act of treason. The head cook, Master Butterwhistle, declared no more pies, no more sauces, no more meats that require translation. The menu was simple: broth, chicken broth, beef broth, mutton broth, one bowl of mystery broth that smelled like regret. Henry stared at it, suspicious. Is this swan? He asked. It's swan adjacent, Butterwhistle replied, sweating. The banquet hall, once filled with laughter and clinking goblets, now echoed with the soft slurping of nobles pretending to enjoy soup. The jester, reassigned as royal broth encourager, danced with a ladle and sang a song titled Ode to the Spoon. It was not well received. Henry, propped up by cushions and a pulley system, surveyed the scene. Where is the roast boar? He demanded. Where is the eel pie? Butterwhistle bowed. Your Majesty, The boar has retired. The eel is on sabbatical. The king grumbled. He sipped. He burped. The ulcer gurgled in protest. The gout twitched. The codpiece sagged. One brave noble attempted to sneak in a sausage. It was confiscated and repurposed as a candle holder. Dessert was a single prune, ceremonially presented on a silver platter. Henry stared at it. "Is this a joke?" he asked. "It's medicinal," whispered the physician. "It's insulting," muttered the king. The banquet ended, not with a toast, but with a collective sigh. The nobles shuffled out, stomachs empty, spirits deflated. Henry remained, surrounded by broth bowls and memories of feasts past. He whispered to his cushion, "Once, I ate an entire goose in one sitting." The cushion said nothing, but it smelled faintly of gravy. And so, the last royal banquet passed into history, not as a celebration, but as a sleepy, soupy farewell to a king whose appetite had once conquered kingdoms and now barely conquered broth. By the 10th week of Henry VIII's royal unraveling, the Palace of Whitehall had developed a peculiar habit. It whispered, not in the ghostly, haunted sense, though there were certainly enough beheaded ex-wives to justify that, but in the gossipy, nosy, deeply Tudor sense. The walls, the tapestries, even the floorboards seemed to carry secrets like chambermaids, with nothing better to do. It began in the long gallery, where a portrait of Henry in his younger, less ulcerous days hung proudly. One night, a servant swore he heard the painting sigh. "He used to have ankles," it muttered. "Now he's just cushions." Word spread. The walls were talking, or rather, they were echoing. Every groan, every wheeze, every royal complaint about broth or codpiece, chafing bounced from corridor to corridor like a gossiping ghost. The courtiers, naturally, leaned in. They began pressing their ears to the paneling, hoping to catch a juicy moan or a muffled royal fart. "He said the prune betrayed him," whispered Lady Featherstone. "He called his foot a traitor," added Lord Snogsbury. Even the servants got involved. The laundry maid claimed the linen closet had revealed the king's bedtime nickname for his ulcer, Sir Pucelot. The stable boy insisted the hayloft knew the contents of the royal will. The jester, now reassigned as palace echo interpreter, began charging a halfpenny for translations. Henry, of course, was unaware, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He spent most of his time muttering to himself, to his foot, or to the codpiece, which had taken to leaning slightly to the left in protest. But the whispers grew louder. One night, a group of nobles gathered in the great hall to test a theory. They shouted, "The king is a sausage," into the fireplace. Moments later, the echo returned. A bloated sausage with gout. Panic ensued. Was the palace alive? Was it possessed? Was it just very well ventilated? The Archbishop of Canterbury was summoned. He blessed the walls. The walls sneezed. The Archbishop left. Eventually, the court settled on a new rule. Do not speak ill of the king within earshot of the wainscoting. A noble was caught whispering near a tapestry and was reassigned to the royal compost heap. And so, Whitehall became a palace of whispers, a place where secrets floated like dust motes, and even the chandeliers seemed judgmental. Henry snored, the ulcer gurgled, the codpiece gleamed, and the walls, ever loyal, kept talking, because in the final days of Henry VIII, even the architecture had opinions. While King Henry VIII wheezed, groaned, and occasionally declared war on his own foot, young Prince Edward his long-awaited heir, had mastered the ancient art of tiptoeing. At just 9 years old, Edward Tudor had already developed the instincts of a seasoned diplomat and the reflexes of a startled deer. He could sense a royal mood swing from 3 corridors away. He knew which floorboards creaked, which tapestries muffled footsteps, and which servants could be bribed with a wink and a boiled sweet. His tutors called him precocious. The jester called him a ghost in hose. Edward's days were filled with Latin, scripture, and the occasional lesson in how not to offend a monarch with a festering leg. His nights, however, were spent navigating the palace like a tiny, anxious ninja. He avoided the chamber of whiffs. He sidestepped the codpiece cushion. He once hid behind a suit of armor for 3 hours to avoid being asked about succession. Henry, for his part, adored his son, in theory. In practice, he often forgot Edward's name and referred to him as the small one with the ears. When Edward entered the room, Henry would bellow, "Ah, my legacy," and then immediately fall asleep. One afternoon, Edward was summoned to the royal bedchamber. He arrived cautiously, flanked by 2 nervous tutors and a priest holding a bowl of lavender water. The king lay among his pillows, eyes half closed, leg elevated like a roast. "Come closer," Henry croaked. Edward obeyed. "Closer," the king repeated. Edward took one more step and promptly tripped over a cushion embroidered with the words, "God save my foot." Henry chuckled. "You'll make a fine king," he said. "Just don't marry 6 women. It's exhausting." Edward nodded solemnly. "Yes, father." "And never trust a man with a beard longer than his sense." "Yes, father. And if your leg ever starts talking, ignore it. It lies." "Yes, father." The moment passed. Henry drifted into a nap. Edward tiptoed out, careful not to disturb the ulcer, the gout, or the codpiece, which had begun to hum softly for reasons no one could explain. Back in his chambers, Edward wrote in his journal, "Father is fading. The court is tense. The codpiece is vibrating. I must remain quiet, clever, and above all, light on my feet." And so, the prince tiptoed on, through corridors of whispers, past portraits that sighed, and into a future that smelled faintly of broth and destiny. As King Henry VIII's body creaked and wheezed like an overstuffed wardrobe, the court turned its attention to a matter of grave importance: the royal will. The document, written in a script so elaborate it required a magnifying glass and a degree in calligraphy to decipher, was meant to secure the future of the realm. It named heirs, assigned titles, and distributed lands like party favors at a very tense birthday party. There was just one problem. No one could find a quill, not just any quill, mind you, the royal signing quill, a feather plucked from a swan that had once glared at the Pope. It was kept in a velvet-lined box, guarded by a man named Sir Scribblethorpe, whose sole job was to protect it from ink stains and theft. But on the morning the will was to be finalized, Sir Scribblethorpe burst into the council chamber, pale and panting. "The quill," he gasped. "It's gone." Panic erupted. The Archbishop dropped his teacup. The Lord Chancellor fainted. The jester, now reassigned as Emergency Stationery Coordinator, began frantically waving a chicken feather and shouting, "This one's fresh." A search commenced. The palace was turned upside down. Tapestries were lifted. Cushions were stabbed. The codpiece was inspected, twice. Still, no quill. Henry, when informed, blinked slowly. Then use my finger, he muttered. Dip it in ink. I am the law. The physicians objected. Your Majesty, your finger is medically compromised. The ulcer gurgled in agreement. Meanwhile, rumors spread. Some said the quill had fled in protest. Others claimed it had been stolen by a faction loyal to Princess Mary, or possibly by the ghost of Anne Boleyn, who was known to dislike paperwork. Eventually, a backup quill was found. A slightly bent goose feather with a suspicious mustard stain. It was presented with great ceremony. Henry squinted at it. This is not my swan, he grumbled. It's a peasant bird. Still, time was short. The will had to be signed. The court gathered in the royal bedchamber, where Henry lay propped up like a tragic souffle. The quill was dipped. The parchment was unrolled. The king's hand trembled. He signed. Sort of. What emerged was less a signature and more a squiggle that resembled a startled eel. The archbishop declared it valid. The Lord Chancellor wept with relief. The jester tried to frame it, and so the royal will was sealed, not with grandeur, but with a borrowed feather and a blot of ink that looked suspiciously like gravy. The future of England was secured. The quill was never seen again. It was a cold January night in Whitehall Palace, and King Henry VIII was preparing for bed, a process that now took 3 servants, a pulley system, and a prayer circle. The king no longer lay down so much as was gently lowered. His bed, once a regal slab of oak and velvet, had transformed into a fortress of fluff. 17 pillows, each embroidered with royal symbols and passive-aggressive Latin phrases, were arranged in a precise configuration known only to the royal bedmaster and one very clever cat. There were pillows for his head, his neck, his gouty foot, his ulcerated leg, his codpiece, which had its own pillow naturally, and one mysterious cushion labeled for emotional support. No one knew what that one was for, but it smelled faintly of lavender and existential dread. The jester, now reassigned as pillow logistics coordinator, oversaw the nightly fluffing. Pillow 12 goes under the left knee, he chirped, unless it's twitching. Then it goes under the right elbow. Henry grunted. I demand symmetry, he wheezed. My body is a temple, a lumpy, sacred temple. The servants nodded solemnly and adjusted pillow 17, which had slipped into a rebellious angle. The king settled in, surrounded by a soft moat of embroidered excess. He resembled a velvet souffle with a crown. But then, disaster. Pillow 9, the one designated for lower lumbar nobility, had gone missing. Panic erupted. The jester dropped his feather duster. The bedmaster fainted. A servant screamed and ran into a tapestry. Henry sat up, or tried to, and bellowed, Find the pillow. I cannot sleep without lumbar dignity. A search commenced. The cushion was eventually found behind the codpiece pillow, sulking. It was returned with apologies and a spritz of rose water. Henry reclined once more. The pillows sighed in unison. The ulcer gurgled. The gout twitched. The codpiece hummed. And then, silence. The king snored. The palace exhaled. The jester tiptoed out, whispering, May the fluff be ever in your favor. Outside, the moon hung low over Whitehall, casting a gentle glow on the sleeping monarch and his fortress of cushions. History paused. The pillows held firm, because in the final days of Henry the Mighty, comfort was king, and 17 pillows were just enough to keep the past at bay. As King Henry VIII's body continued its slow transformation into a royal beanbag, The Archbishop of Canterbury was summoned for a final rite, a solemn blessing to prepare the monarch's soul for its heavenly audit. The Archbishop, a tall man with a voice like warm porridge and a beard that doubled as a bookmark, arrived at Whitehall with holy oils, sacred texts, and a vague sense of dread. He had blessed many nobles before, but none quite so fragrant. Henry lay in his bed, surrounded by 17 pillows, a humming codpiece, and a leg ulcer that had recently begun quoting scripture. The room smelled of lavender, broth, and something that made the Archbishop's eyes water. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing deeply, "I come to offer comfort and divine peace." Henry blinked. "Do you have ointment?" "I have prayer." "Does it sting?" "Only the soul." The Archbishop began the rite, chanting softly in Latin while waving incense. The incense, unfortunately, collided with Sir Flatulence, who had been lying dormant, but chose that moment to awaken with a vengeance. A sound emerged, long, mournful, and vaguely ecclesiastical. The Archbishop paused. The jester, now reassigned as liturgical air manager, rang a small bell and whispered, "That's a level 3. The Archbishop continued, bravely pressing forward. He anointed the king's forehead, then his hands, then hesitated at the foot. "Do I bless the ulcer?" he asked. Henry nodded solemnly. "It has suffered." The Archbishop dabbed it with oil. The ulcer hissed. A tapestry fell off the wall. Next came the codpiece. The Archbishop stared at it. It gleamed. It pulsed. It emitted a faint hum in D minor. "I shall skip that part," he murmured. Henry grunted. "Coward." The blessing concluded with a prayer for mercy, a request for forgiveness, and a brief moment of silence, interrupted only by the gout twitching in protest and the jester sneezing into a candle. The Archbishop bowed once more. "May your soul find peace, Your Majesty." Henry smiled faintly. "May my foot find vengeance." And with that, the Archbishop departed, robes billowing, eyes watering, and holy oils slightly singed. The court resumed its tiptoeing. The ulcer resumed its gurgling. The codpiece resumed its humming. Because in the final days of Henry VIII, even divine blessings had to compete with digestive drama. It was a still, moonlit night in Whitehall Palace. The fire crackled softly. The tapestries swayed with the occasional draft. And in the royal bedchamber, King Henry VIII lay nestled in his fortress of 17 pillows, his codpiece humming faintly like a lute with stage fright. The end was near. The physicians had stopped prescribing. The priests had stopped blessing. Even the ulcer had gone quiet, as if pausing out of respect or exhaustion. The court stood vigil, a collection of nobles, servants, and one jester, now reassigned as Royal Transition Mood Manager, all waiting for the final royal breath. Henry stirred. He opened one eye, then the other. "Is it morning?" he rasped. "No, Your Majesty," whispered the Archbishop. "It is twilight." Henry blinked. "I always hated twilight. Too indecisive." The room fell silent. The king's breathing slowed. The codpiece dimmed. The gout twitched once, then stilled. And then it happened. A sound emerged. Long, low, regal. It began as a whisper, rose to a murmur, and ended in a soft, triumphant toot. The final royal fart. No one moved. The Archbishop crossed himself. The jester dropped his lavender sachet. A tapestry fluttered off the wall, possibly in protest. The sound echoed through the chamber, down the corridor, and into the annals of history. It was not loud, but it was decisive, a punctuation mark on a life of indulgence, drama, and deeply questionable dietary choices. Henry exhaled. "Tell them," he whispered. It was majestic, and then he was gone. The court stood in stunned silence. The jester cleared his throat. "Shall I record that in the Royal Chronicle?" The archbishop nodded solemnly. "Yes, but use Latin. It sounds more dignified." Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Inside, the king lay still, surrounded by pillows, ghosts, and the faint scent of boiled mutton. And so ended the reign of Henry VIII, not with a sword, nor a sermon, but with a sigh, a squelch, and a final gust of royal absurdity. When King Henry VIII finally wheezed his last wheeze, the palace mourned. The ulcer gurgled one final time. The codpiece dimmed. The pillows deflated in grief, and the royal carpenters were summoned to prepare the king's final resting place. They arrived with solemn expressions and a coffin, a grand, velvet-lined, lion-carved masterpiece of Tudor craftsmanship. It had been commissioned years earlier, back when Henry still had ankles and a waistline. It was regal. It was ornate. It was optimistic. Because Henry didn't fit, the carpenters stared. The physicians winced. The jester, now reassigned as posthumous spatial consultant, whispered, "Perhaps if we butter the elbows?" The royal body, swollen from years of indulgence and a final week of broth-based rebellion, refused to cooperate. The ulcer had expanded. The gout had flared. The codpiece had taken on a defiant tilt. And the pillows, all 17, had been requested to accompany him into the afterlife. "Remove the pillows," someone suggested. Gasps echoed through the chamber. "He shall not be buried without lumbar dignity," cried Lady Featherstone, clutching pillow 9 like a relic. The archbishop offered a prayer for compression. The carpenters offered a second coffin, wider, deeper, and slightly resentful. It had been intended for a duke who once ate an entire ox in one sitting. Henry had out-eaten them all. The transfer was delicate. The ulcer hissed. The codpiece hummed. A tapestry fell off the wall in protest. Eventually, with the help of a pulley system, 3 servants, and a generous application of goose grease, the king was lowered in. But the lid wouldn't close. The jester suggested a royal sash to cinch the situation. It snapped. A servant fainted. The codpiece was gently tucked in with a prayer and a wooden spoon. Finally, after much pushing, puffing, and one brief moment involving a velvet mallet, the lid was sealed. The coffin groaned. The cherubs carved into the sides looked mildly alarmed. As it was wheeled out, a muffled toot echoed from within. The court paused. The archbishop crossed himself. The jester bowed. "Even in death," he said, "His Majesty remains expressive." And so, Henry VIII was laid to rest, not with grace, but with gusto. The coffin held firm. The pillows wept. The codpiece hummed. Because in the final chapter of Henry's reign, even the grave had to make room for royal excess. The day of King Henry VIII's funeral dawned cold, damp, and deeply theatrical, just as he would have wanted. The royal coffin, reinforced with extra oak and emotional baggage, was wheeled out of Whitehall with great ceremony. It groaned under the weight of velvet, regret, and 17 commemorative pillows, each embroidered with phrases like "he ate well" and "gout but glorious." The procession was meant to be solemn. It was meant to be majestic. It was, instead, a slow-moving parade of pity Leading the way was the archbishop, clutching a scroll and a scented handkerchief. Behind him came the jester, now reassigned as funeral vibe coordinator, tossing dried rose petals and whispering he was large, he was loud, he was occasionally fragrant. Next came the royal falcon, perched on a velvet pole, looking mildly traumatized. Then the codpiece, carried separately on a satin cushion, humming faintly in D minor. It had been declared too historically significant to be buried. The nobles followed, dressed in black and confusion. Lady Featherstone sobbed into a pillow. Lord Snogsbury tripped over a tapestry. One duke brought a ham, just in case. The coffin rolled slowly through the streets, pulled by 6 horses and one very nervous monk. The crowd watched in silence, unsure whether to mourn or marvel. Children whispered, "Is that the king?" Adults replied, "No, that's just the leg section." At one point, the procession paused to adjust the coffin's angle. It had begun listing to the left, pulled by the gravitational force of the codpiece. A carpenter was summoned. He wept softly. The final stretch led to St. George's Chapel, where the choir sang a dirge, titled Ode to the Wheeze. It featured 3 lutes, 2 viols, and one unexpected trumpet solo that startled a bishop. Inside the chapel, the coffin was lowered with great effort and mild panic. The ulcer gurgled one last time. The pillows were arranged in a ceremonial pyramid. The codpiece was placed on a pedestal, surrounded by candles and confused historians. The archbishop delivered the eulogy. He ruled with vigor. He feasted with fury. He married with enthusiasm. And he passed with acoustics. The crowd nodded. The jester dabbed his eyes with a gravy-stained handkerchief. The falcon flew away. And so, the procession of pity ended, not with triumph, but with tenderness. The king was gone. The court exhaled. The codpiece hummed, because in the final farewell of Henry VIII, even sorrow had a sense of humor. After the procession of pity had wheeled King Henry VIII's reinforced coffin through the streets of London, past weeping nobles, confused peasants, and one codpiece on a velvet cushion, the final destination loomed: St. George's Chapel at Windsor. The tomb had been prepared years earlier, back when Henry still believed he'd be remembered as a warrior poet and not a gaudy buffet enthusiast. It was grand. It was solemn. It was slightly too close to Jane Seymour's resting place for comfort. The chapel itself was quiet, echoing with centuries of royal ambition and mild architectural smugness. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, depicting saints, swords, and one suspiciously plump angel that looked a lot like Henry. The coffin was lowered with ceremony, caution, and a pulley system that had been reinforced after the codpiece incident. The tomb groaned. The floor creaked. A tapestry fell off the wall, possibly in protest. Henry's final resting place was surrounded by marble, Latin inscriptions, and a view, a literal view, of the royal gardens. It had been designed so that, in theory, the king could gaze upon England's glory for eternity. In practice, it meant he was buried facing a hedge shaped like a goose. The jester, now reassigned as posthumous landscape interpreter, whispered he would have wanted more gravy fountains. The tomb was sealed. The pillows were arranged in a ceremonial crescent. The codpiece was placed in a niche with its own candle and a plaque reading, "He led with this." Visitors came and went. Some wept. Some bowed. One child asked, "Is this where the fart came from?" The priest nodded solemnly, and so Henry VIII was laid to rest, not in silence, but in style. His tomb stood firm, his legacy loomed large, and his view remained leafy, because in the end, even kings deserve a tomb with a view, preferably one that doesn't smell like broth. It began, as all great Tudor mysteries do, with a puddle, not a dramatic flood, not a holy spring, just a quiet, suspicious puddle beneath the marble tomb of King Henry VIII, a puddle that smelled faintly of broth and royal defiance. The chapel custodian, Brother Mopsley, discovered it during his morning sweep. He stared at it. It stared back. Condensation, he whispered. Divine tears. The puddle burbled. Mopsley fled. Word spread quickly. The tomb was leaking. The archbishop was summoned. He sniffed the puddle, crossed himself, and declared, "It is either a miracle or a plumbing issue." The jester, now reassigned as posthumous moisture analyst, suggested it was Henry's final protest against being sealed without his codpiece. The court panicked. Was the king fermenting? Was the coffin too full of pillows? Had the ulcer achieved sentience and begun tunneling? A team of royal engineers arrived, armed with chisels, scrolls, and one very nervous goose. They examined the tomb. They tapped. They sniffed. One fainted. The puddle grew. Theories abounded. Theory 1, the coffin had been overstuffed. Between the velvet, the pillows, and the ceremonial gravy sachet, something had to give. Theory 2, the codpiece, sealed in its niche, was weeping. "It misses him," whispered Lady Featherstone. Theory 3, Henry was simply refusing to stay buried. "He was never good at endings," muttered Lord Snogsbury. Eventually, the puddle was declared historically significant. A velvet rope was placed around it. Tourists were invited to gaze upon the leak of majesty. Someone tried bottling it. The jester sold commemorative towels. The chapel staff installed a discreet drainage system. The puddle persisted. It became a legend, whispered about in taverns, debated by scholars, and occasionally mistaken for soup. And so, Henry VIII's tomb became more than a resting place. It became a fountain of folklore, a soggy monument to excess, and a reminder that even in death, the king refused to be tidy, because in the end, history doesn't always dry clean. Henry VIII was buried, officially, ceremonially, with velvet, Latin, and a codpiece shrine. But rest? That was another matter. The tomb at St. George's Chapel was sealed, the pillows arranged, and the plaque polished to a royal gleam. Yet strange things began to happen. The marble groaned. The air grew wheezy. Visitors reported odd sounds. A faint snore, a distant gurgle, a muffled toot. One monk claimed the tomb sighed when he walked past with a bowl of broth. Another swore he heard the words, "More cushions" echo from the stone. The jester, now reassigned as royal afterlife liaison, insisted Henry was simply adjusting. He was never good at stillness, he explained. Even his ghost needs lumbar support. The codpiece, displayed nearby, began to hum again, low, rhythmic, almost contemplative. A scholar declared it posthumous resonance. A servant called it haunted fashion. The chapel staff installed extra candles. The archbishop performed a second blessing. The pillows were fluffed weakly. Still the tomb twitched. One night, a gust of wind blew through the chapel, rustling tapestries and extinguishing candles. The tomb creaked. A tapestry fell. The codpiece hummed in D minor. And then, silence. The kind of silence that feels like a sigh, like a king finally settling into his cushions, like a realm exhaling after decades of drama, gout, and gravy. Henry VIII, at last, was still, not quite resting, not quite haunting, just lingering, like a royal echo, like a wheeze on the wind. And so ends The Wheeze of Kings, a tale of ulcers, codpieces, and one monarch's majestic refusal to go quietly. Sleep now, dear reader. Let the pillows cradle your dreams. Let the codpiece hum you to sleep. Let history wheeze softly in the background. Good night.